On Monday, June 4th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe called in sick for the 17th time, pushing production of Something's Gotta Give weeks behind schedule. Her co-star and male lead, Dean Martin, had finally had enough of waiting and stormed off set, effectively halting production. This was the breaking point. The studio was now $1 million over budget, and Marilyn was on the verge of being fired. Something's Gotta Give is often remembered as Marilyn Monroe's last unfinished film, but why did it fall apart in the first place? This video will examine how a movie meant to be efficient, familiar, and profitable collapsed, what that reveals about where Marilyn stood at the end of her career, and why she has carried the blame ever since. To understand how it all went wrong, we have to go back to the very beginning, to how this film came into existence in the first place. Something's Gotta Give was a film that on the surface fit neatly within the kind of role audiences already associated with Marilyn Monroe. The film was a remake of the classic screwball comedy My Favorite Wife from 1940, originally starring Cary Grant and Irene Dunne. The story centers on a married man whose wife is presumed dead after disappearing at sea. Years later, after he has remarried and started a new family, the first wife unexpectedly returns, setting off a romantic comedy of mistaken identity and jealousy. Marilyn was paired with Dean Martin as her husband, Tom Tryon as the man she survives with while presumed dead, and Sid Charisse as the second wife. On paper, it was a conventional, star-driven studio comedy designed to be effective and marketable. In many ways, Something's Gotta Give was a safe route for Marilyn, a return to a familiar screen persona she had played many times before. Yet, on paper, the role suggests room for subtle change, hinting at an evolution rather than a complete repeat into the past. Still, the irony is unavoidable. Marilyn had spent years trying to break free from the very image this film seemed to revive. As she once put it, "Some people have been unkind. If I say I want to grow as an actress, they laugh." A frustration that followed her throughout her career. Her attempt at independence through her own production company named Marilyn Monroe Productions had failed after producing only 2 films, Bus Stop in 1956 and The Prince and the Showgirl in 1957, and by the early 60s it had effectively come to an end. The Misfits, written for her by her husband Arthur Miller, proved physically and emotionally draining, failed to reset her career, and ended with the breakdown of her marriage before the film even finished. Despite everything, she remained bound to the realities of the studio system. Marilyn still owed 20th Century Fox 2 pictures under a contract she could not escape. Something's Gotta Give wasn't simply a creative choice, it was an obligation, and one the studio was heavily invested in seeing fulfilled. At the same time, Fox had its own pressures. By the early 1960s, the studio was struggling financially, and a reliable Marilyn Monroe comedy represented a familiar kind of insurance, a project meant to be efficient, marketable, and a safe box office hit. Both Fox and Marilyn, returning to a recognizable, audience-friendly role, seemed like a practical solution, even if it meant stepping back into a persona Marilyn had been trying to escape. After more than a year away from the screen, Marilyn Monroe returned to work with something to prove. George Cukor was selected as director, a choice Marilyn supported after securing director approval and her renegotiated contract with Fox. The two had worked together before on Let's Make Love, a production marked by tension over absences and many retakes. Despite that history, both were contractually obligated to Fox and reunited for Something's Gotta Give. Before filming even began, the production was already strained. Rather than repurposing an existing Fox backlot set for what was intended to be a modest romantic comedy, Cukor pushed for the construction of an elaborate exterior set which was a replica of his own home, a decision that immediately inflated costs and delayed preparation for the film. At the same time, dissatisfaction with the script led to repeated revisions. The screenplay passed through 5 different writers as Cukor sought to refine the tone and structure of the script, slowing pre-production and pushing the film behind schedule before cameras even started rolling. Filming was scheduled to begin in early April 1962, but almost immediately ran into trouble. Marilyn fell ill with a severe sinus infection, and a studio doctor recommended delaying production for several weeks. George Cukor chose to proceed without her anyways, officially beginning filming on April 23, 1962, and reorganized the schedule to shoot scenes that did not require Marilyn, a difficult option given that she was the film star. April 30th, a full week after filming had already began, marked the first day Marilyn appeared on set. After just her second day of work, she collapsed and was sent home, further disrupting an already fragile schedule and setting the tone for how the rest of the production would unfold. Sid Charisse later recalled that early on, George Cukor worked to calm a nervous crew, urging patience rather than panic. As she remembered it, Cukor stated, "You don't worry about anything, this is all gonna be fine. Marilyn, we have to have patience with her. This isn't unusual at all, but she's so wonderful that the results will certainly be worth it." At that stage, Marilyn's absences were frustrating, but not yet viewed as catastrophic. Despite the growing strain, there were moments when the film showed real promise. When Marilyn was present and well, she knew her lines, appeared confident on camera, and looked radiant. The role would have marked several firsts for Marilyn: her first time playing a wife and a mother, and a noticeably more natural, grounded version of her familiar screen persona. Crew members later recalled how warm and attentive she was with the child actors, and the surviving footage suggests a performance that was an evolution of Marilyn Monroe as an artist. Another first for not only Marilyn, but for American cinema, would have been featured in this film. The film included a swimming pool scene in which Marilyn's character goes skinny dipping to lure her husband back to her, which would have been one of the first nude scenes by a major star in a mainstream Hollywood studio film since the strict enforcement of the Hays Code. Although she was initially given a flesh-covered swimming suit to wear, Marilyn chose to remove it and perform the scene nude. Aware of the negative press surrounding the troubled production, she invited photographers to document the moment, turning a vulnerable scene into a calculated media event. The images quickly became iconic, appearing on the cover of Life magazine and shifting the conversation from a problematic star to the sensational Marilyn Monroe. Even amid chaos, Marilyn knew when to fully step into the persona that made her famous, using it not just to perform, but to regain control of the narrative. But those moments of magic were inconsistent and didn't last. For instance, Marilyn relied heavily on acting coach Paula Strasberg, a figure she had grown close to during her time studying at the Actors Studio in New York City, where she was actively trying to refine her craft and be taken more seriously as an actress. On set, Marilyn frequently deferred to Strasberg's judgment rather than the director's. Scenes were reshot multiple times, slowing progress and frustrating the crew. Strasberg was paid $5,000 per week, meaning that over the course of an 8-week shoot, she would have earned nearly half of Marilyn's $100,000 salary, an arrangement many on set viewed as excessive for a light studio comedy, and a visible sign of how Marilyn's perfectionism combined with a breakdown in authority was disrupting the production. Tensions peaked in May when Marilyn took time off to fly to New York City to sing Happy Birthday to President John F. Kennedy, a highly publicized appearance that further inflamed resentment among cast and crew. By early June, Marilyn had appeared for only 12 of the roughly 30 scheduled shooting days, leaving the production many days behind schedule. As delays mounted, perceptions on set began to shift. Producer Gene Allen later remarked that Marilyn often appeared healthy, noting that he never personally saw evidence of the illness that shut production down. Writer Walter Bernstein echoed a similar unease, recalling that while he initially believed that she was simply prone to colds, he eventually felt something deeper was wrong, describing pronounced mood swings and a sense that she was rarely fully there. Whether accurate or not, these impressions fueled frustration and helped turn impatience into blame. On June 2nd, the situation finally reached a breaking point. Dean Martin arrived on set sick but ready to work, only to spend the entire day waiting to see if Marilyn would show up. Eventually, Marilyn, fearing she would get sick from Dean, called in sick yet again and chose not to come in. After hours of waiting with no sign she would appear, Dean Martin had enough and stormed off set, effectively shutting down production. Days later, on June 7th, 20th Century Fox announced that Marilyn had been fired, citing what they called spectacular absenteeism, and moved to sue her for breach of contract. In the public eye, the collapse of Something's Gotta Give was quickly pinned on Marilyn alone. Even George Cukor, whose own creative decisions had contributed to delays and rising costs, took his complaints to gossip columnist Hedda Hopper, helping cement a narrative of Marilyn as the sole problem. By this point, it was undeniable that Marilyn was not physically well and that her absences caused real disruptions. But the production had been unstable from the start, creatively, financially, and structurally, which raises the central question this story demands. Was it fair to blame Marilyn Monroe for everything that went wrong? It's true that Marilyn Monroe had a reputation for being difficult on set. She was often late, called in sick, and demanded retake after retake, patterns that followed her throughout her career. Studios and directors alike knew this going in, yet they also knew what she could deliver when everything aligned. Billy Wilder, who worked with Marilyn on Some Like It Hot, openly acknowledged both sides of her talent, saying Marilyn Monroe was sensitive and very difficult, but when she finally came through, her inhibition disappeared, and after that she was phenomenal, one of the greatest comedians. Wilder noted that working with her required patience, adding that the metabolism had to be right with her, but when it was, she was a marvelous thing to direct. Studios understood that trade-off, because when it worked, the results were undeniable. 20th Century Fox understood this well. They knew Marilyn was fragile before filming on Something's Gotta Give even began. In fact, only weeks before production, Marilyn had overdosed and was found unconscious in her home, a clear warning sign that she was not well enough to sustain a demanding shoot. Even doctors urged caution, but the studio chose to push forward anyways because Fox believed the risk was worth the potential reward. This becomes clearer when Something's Gotta Give is placed within the larger crisis already consuming Fox. At the very moment Marilyn's film went into production in the spring of 1962, Fox was already bleeding money on Cleopatra, the epic starring Elizabeth Taylor that had spiraled wildly out of control. That production had ballooned from an initial budget of just $2 million to over $44 million, and was still actively shooting overseas while Something's Gotta Give struggled to stay on schedule. Faced with mounting losses, Fox needed something dependable and fast. Something's Gotta Give was conceived as that solution, a familiar Marilyn Monroe comedy, inexpensive by comparison, and expected to deliver a reliable box office return, while Cleopatra continued to drain the studio. Elizabeth herself had been seriously ill earlier in production, became embroiled in a highly publicized affair, and nearly died due to an illness. Yet Fox protected its massive investment and pushed forward at all costs. Elizabeth Taylor was paid a record-breaking $1 million and was seen as a guaranteed global draw. Marilyn Monroe, on the other hand, earning just $100,000 for Something's Gotta Give and coming off a string of underperforming films, no longer enjoyed the same institutional protection by the studio. When problems arose, Fox absorbed all the chaos around Elizabeth, but quickly hardened its stance toward Marilyn. Both productions shared the same core flaw: studios pushing ahead with unstable projects, demanding results from performers who clearly were unwell, and prioritizing financial recovery over realistic working conditions. When Something's Gotta Give collapsed, blaming Marilyn alone was convenient, but it wasn't the full truth. Marilyn caused problems. There is absolutely no denying that. But the failure of Something's Gotta Give was not the failure of one actress, it was the result of a studio under pressure, making mistakes it could no longer afford, and choosing who would carry the blame. After being fired on June 7, 1962, Marilyn Monroe did not disappear or retreat. Instead, she fought to get her role back. Despite the studio's public statements blaming her for the collapse of production, Marilyn began negotiating with 20th Century Fox, determined to finish the film and repair the damage to her reputation. In the midst of this public fallout, Marilyn finally spoke for herself. In her last ever interview conducted with Life magazine in July 1962, she reflected on her relationship with the studio system and the way her image had been shaped and exploited by others. She stated, "I don't look at myself as a commodity, but I'm sure a lot of people have, including, well, one corporation in particular, which shall be nameless." It was a restrained but unmistakable rebuke. After years of being marketed as an asset and blamed when the system broke down, Marilyn was asserting something she had long been denied: control over her own narrative. Behind the scenes, Fox explored the possibility of recasting the role of Ellen Arden, but that plan immediately ran into resistance. Dean Martin, who had walked off the set weeks earlier, refused to work with any replacement. He made it clear that he had agreed to do the film because of Marilyn, and without her, there would be no movie. Facing mounting pressure, Marilyn pushed to restart the project and reopened negotiations with Fox, this time from a position of renewed leverage. On August 1st, 1962, she signed a newly renegotiated contract that did far more than simply bring her back. Fox agreed to raise her salary for Something's Gotta Give from $100,000 to $250,000, and she was also granted a new $1 million deal for 2 additional films, elevating her pay to $500,000 per picture. Plans were made to resume production with a new director and without her acting coach Paula Strasberg, a major concession by the studio and a clear signal that Fox still needed Marilyn more than it was willing to admit. Just days later, on August 4th, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her home. With her death, the original production came to an abrupt end. The existing footage was shelved, the sets were dismantled, and Something's Gotta Give remained unfinished. After Marilyn Monroe's death, the story of Something's Gotta Give didn't end there. The project didn't disappear entirely. It was reworked, recast, and released in 1963 as Move Over Darling, starring Doris Day. The remake was a commercial success, but it answered a different question. It showed what the movie could be, not what Marilyn's version might have been. And that's the lingering ache at the center of Something's Gotta Give. For decades, the version of the film existed only as rumor. Then, in 1999, editors returned to the studio archives and uncovered nearly 9 hours of surviving footage. Using production notes left behind by the original director, they assembled what they could. The results just run 37 minutes, rough, fragmented, and unmistakably unfinished. Marilyn appears for only a few minutes of that footage, and yet, even in fragments, her presence is unmistakable. The timing is there, the charm is there, the talent still flickers through the unfinished scenes. It's not a complete performance, but it's enough to remind us that her spark hadn't vanished. Something's Gotta Give ultimately leaves us not with answers, but with more questions. Not with a final statement, but with a glimpse of a direction that was never fully explored. In that way, the film mirrors Marilyn Monroe herself. Unfinished, often misunderstood, and still capable of surprising us even with what remains.